This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the very first full episode of Here's How, published on the 10th of February 2015. Coming up in the show, the whip system in Dáil Éireann. Should we abolish it? Can we abolish it? The benefits and the risks of credit unions in Ireland. And would Dublin be a better city if it had a directly elected Lord Mayor?
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here we go again. Here we go again. During the boom, the banks were firing out 100% mortgages and 110% mortgages, saying that they were helping people to get on the housing ladder. It was a lie. Anyone who thinks about it for even a moment should know that it was a lie. Of course, someone going into the bank and getting a bigger loan than they should have, they think, woohoo, now I can go and bid more and get that house. But if the person who they're bidding against can get a bigger loan as well, then there's no change of the relative position of any buyer in the market. Either you're one of the people who has enough money to get any given house, or you're not. The only change is that the person buying the house is deeper in debt and property prices are driven up with their extra borrowings. And of course, the property speculators are deeper into their millions with those extra borrowings. All that it helped them to do was to bid the price of the property up further. There was still the same number of buyers, all of them with more money, and still the same number of houses for sale and massive increases in the prices as a result. And the banks were so falling over themselves eager to lend that money that they lost the run of themselves and they went bust, and we all know that story. So the governor of the central bank, Patrick Honohan, was to announce rules at the end of January to limit lending. The rules were supposed to allow a maximum loan of 80% of the value of the house. Then the special interests kicked in. So at the end of January, the rules were announced and we got a fudge. There'll be an 80% limit, but it won't apply to first-time buyers for loans up to €220,000. Listen to the way that RTE presented that news.
Prospective home buyers will now have to save bigger deposits under new mortgage lending regulations announced by the central bank, though there will be some relief for first-time buyers. Under the plan, banks will only be able to lend up to a maximum of 80% of a property's value. However, first-time buyers will be able to borrow up to 90% to a limit of €220,000.
So pushing first-time buyers into borrowing more money is called some relief for them. That's not relief. They're not getting anything extra, except extra debt, of course. They won't get a nicer house because they'll be competing with all the other first-time buyers, and they'll all be getting that so-called extra relief as well of borrowing more money. I don't think that the speculators see that as a victory. They were straight out of the traps, whinging that even these watered-down rules were too much. The chief executive, Pat Devitt, the chief executive of the Institute of Professional Auctioneers and Valuers, said, and this is a quote, he said, "It was devastating coming at this time at the beginning of the recovery of the property market." Yeah, devastating for who? And of course, right on cue, Fianna Fáil finance spokesman Michael McGrath said that the new rules would potentially result in thousands of buyers being trapped due to the onerous 20% deposit rule. But it doesn't stop there. Now, common sense should tell you that anybody who's not able to save the deposit for a house shouldn't be getting a mortgage in the first place. But don't tell that to the credit unions. The banks are itching to get back into profiteering from pushing people into too much debt. But the credit unions don't want to be missing out on getting their snouts in the trough either. Now bear in mind that it's a legal requirement for anyone giving out a mortgage to check that the borrower is getting the deposit from their own funds and from their own savings, that it's not just a loan from somewhere else or a loan from a bank that they got around the corner before they came in to apply for the mortgage. But anybody who lives in Ireland knows that left, right and centre there were parents and other relatives giving soft loans and giving straight up gifts of cash to their children who were looking to buy a house, supposedly helping them get the deposit together. And if the parents didn't have the money to give, they'd go down to the credit union and borrow the money in their own name, in the parents' name, and say that they were going to do up their house or whatever, and instead they'd give the money to their kids for them to say that it was their own savings for a deposit. Well, they don't have to do that anymore. Because last Sunday, that's the 8th of February, the Sunday Independent reported that the credit union movement is earmarking €100 million to loan to people for them to give to their kids to present as their savings, as their deposit, so that they can get that 90% mortgage without actually having to save up a cent of a real deposit. So basically that means that anybody can buy a house without so much as a Mars bar and a packet of crisps as a real deposit. And if anyone can buy a house without a deposit, then all the houses will go to the people who are mad enough to bid the highest prices. And if you don't go mad too, then you'll never get a house. Here we go again. We'll be talking to Dublin City Councillor Andrew Montague later on about ways that we can actually provide real housing for people.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Hello, my name is Dermot Lacey. I'm a Labour Party Dublin City Councillor. There's been a lot of talk recently about the need for political reform, and that seems to centre on reform of the Dáil and the Seanad. My view is that you can't reform either of those places sufficiently unless you first of all reform local government. Local government is where political services, where political values, where political ideologies are put into practice or not, and where the more immediate needs of the people are delivered. In my view, the starting point for that is a directly elected Mayor of Dublin who would preside over an old Dublin council. It wouldn't be broken into the four areas that it's broken into at the moment. And I'd like to encourage your listeners to join the campaign for a directly elected mayor, put pressure on politicians of all political parties to include a commitment for a directly elected mayor in their election manifestos. I believe that in delivering for Dublin, we're delivering for Ireland. Making Dublin a better place helps to make Ireland a better place. To join the campaign, a directly elected mayor for Dublin in the election manifesto. Let's call for it, and then let's make sure they deliver on it.
Dermot Lacey, Dublin City Councillor, I completely agree. In fact, I agree with lots of the things that you said. One of the things you said is that what's good for Dublin is good for Ireland, and that's a lesson that an awful lot of local politicians in rural Ireland should learn. Rural Ireland can't compete with Dublin. Rural Ireland and Dublin should be complementary. It's not a zero-sum game. But the main point of what you're saying was that Dublin needs a directly elected Lord Mayor. And you don't have to be a HR expert to know that when somebody is known to be responsible for a job, and when somebody has the power to do that job, you're going to get that job done better. You only need to have looked at the Batman series from the 1970s, where this stage Irish police chief of Gotham City tells Batman in every episode that he's got the mayor on the phone to him giving out. When you've got somebody who is responsible and who's known to be responsible for that job, and who's going to lose their job if they don't do it properly, then they're more likely to do that job properly. Unfortunately, that isn't the position that we have in Irish local government. In Dublin and almost every local council around the country, most people don't even know who their local councillor is unless they're really politically engaged. One of the reasons is because we have so many. In a tiny country, we have more than 1,000 local councillors, and now we have electoral areas with up to 10 different local councils. Most people in Ireland can't even name 10 politicians in total, so they have no hope of remembering 10 different local councillors that serve their area. And even if they did know them, it'd be no good, because those local councillors have almost no power. In local government in Ireland, the real power resides with the permanent staff. These county managers on 100 and 150,000 euro salaries get to do what they like with zero democratic responsibility. So yes, I agree. Let's have somebody who's known to everybody, one directly elected mayor for the whole of Dublin, give them a 5-year term, and let people see if they succeed or fail, like in London. In London, since the directly elected mayor was introduced, first Ken Livingstone and secondly Boris Johnson. And note that I know by heart, and I think many people will recognise the names, I know by heart the mayors of London for the past decade. Most people would not know the current mayor of Dublin. In any case, give them the job and let them fail or succeed, and let them get the rewards for failing and succeeding. Although you're a long-time Dublin City Councillor, Dermot, I'm not, so I've no idea who you're thinking of as the first candidate.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
My name is Thomas and I'm from County Leitrim. And I would like to say, in relation to the party whip system currently operated in Ireland, that it's not fit for purpose for modern parliamentary democracy. The advocate of the current...
Apologies to Tomas there. I'm cutting that call short because the quality of the line isn't very good, but I think we can hear what he's saying, that he's arguing for the abolition of the whip system on non-confidence votes. So not on the budget or something like that, but on a vote, for example, like Irish Water, TDs will be allowed to vote any way they want. Now, the whip system was essentially invented by Charles Stewart Parnell in Westminster in the Irish Party more than 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago. And the advantage for him was that it made him vastly more powerful in the Westminster Parliament, because he knew that all of his MPs at the time would vote with him, rather than being scattered across the chamber, each voting against the other and cancelling each other out. And he took a lot of power, a lot more power than he might otherwise have had in Westminster, because of that whip system that he invented. The problem with trying to abolish the whip system is that it doesn't really exist, in the sense that it doesn't exist in the Constitution, it has no standing in law, it's only an internal party rule within each of our political parties. And politicians can choose to follow that rule and remain in a political party, or not. They can leave a party and leave that whip system behind if they choose to do that. The fact that most politicians are in parties, I think, is an indication that they realise they have more power when they act together as a party than they do if they end up essentially voting against each other and cancelling each other out. That's why they're doing it. Now, we would run into problems with European human rights legislation, and probably with the Constitution as well, if you tried to bring in a law that banned the whip system within private organisations, which is what a political party essentially is. But let's say that that didn't happen. Let's say that we could imagine a world where we could outlaw the whip system. There are some independents around the country. You might think of Luke Main Flanagan in Roscommon, or the Healy Rays in Kerry. They're sort of rock star independents. Everybody knows about them. Everybody knows what their political stances are. They know what they're getting when they're voting for them, whether you agree with them or not. But not all politicians are like that. Most of them are pretty pasty wallflowers. And the branding of a political party is very important when people go to vote. When people go to vote, they know a lot about the people they're voting for, mostly because they know what they stand for from the political party that they're in. If somebody's in Fianna Fáil, the voter knows that that person is going to vote in a whole different way than if they're in, for example, the Anti-Austerity Alliance. And that means that voters are better educated about who they're voting for. I don't think that most voters have the degree of engagement that would be required to find out the detailed policy of every one of 15 or 20 individual politicians, individual, essentially independent candidates, if they had to analyse their view, the view of each of those 15 candidates on each issue that they're involved with, that they are interested in. And for that reason, I think the whip system is a good idea. I think it's a good idea because it makes a shorthand for voters. They have a good idea who stands where, and they have a good idea who they're voting for when they see the party name beside the politician's name on the ballot paper. If you take away the whip system, many people, essentially won't know what they're voting for, and that's why I think it's a good idea.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Hello, my name is Noel French. I'm a councillor on Meath County Council. I'm a Fine Gael councillor, and I've put a motion to Meath County Council, and it has been passed at its January meeting, requesting the Minister for Finance to support a personal microfinance scheme through the credit unions to provide small loans to those on low incomes as an alternative to money lenders. Credit unions were introduced into Ireland to provide small loans at reasonable cost, self-financing for those who could not go to the banks. Local people made funds available for their neighbours to borrow, and it was mutual self-help. Credit unions have been very useful over the years in providing small loans for first communions, to replace a broken washing machine, to cope with a sudden illness. These were small loans which by and large were paid back by their members. By serving its local community and members with small loans, the credit union movement grew. During the Celtic Tiger period, some credit unions got caught up in the reckless lending and investment and got into trouble. As a result, credit unions have had to submit to a whole raft of new regulations, and rightly so. But people are saying that credit unions are getting like banks. This is being reflected in the amount of loans being taken out, which has fallen drastically, and which is affecting the viability of credit unions going forward. But this new regime is difficult for vulnerable borrowers who instead are turning to money lenders who are operating within the law but are charging very high interest rates. Last year, 360,000 people used legal money lenders in Ireland. Yes, 360,000 people using money lenders. The lack of an alternative is causing vulnerable people to get into debt, creating huge difficulties for families. What I am calling for is the Minister for Finance to consider providing a joint funding mechanism where the Department of Finance or a guarantee fund would guarantee 50% of a small personal loan under €500, while the credit union will guarantee the other 50%. There would have to be special legislation to allow credit unions to make these loans. Such a scheme would allow credit unions to provide vulnerable people with necessary funding. Funding for such a scheme could be by way of fines paid by other financial institutions. A system just like this operates in Australia through the Good Shepherd microfinance scheme, where 95% of all loans are repaid. MABS would support such a microfinance scheme here in Ireland as well. The vulnerable people of Ireland deserve to be protected, and our credit unions could get back to the job they do best, serving the community.
I couldn't agree more that credit unions providing microfinance are a very important feature of Irish society. I'll come back to my reservations in a moment, but anybody who thinks that credit unions are fuddy-duddy, get on Google or have a look at the links that I give on the web page for this show, and have a look at the payday lenders that operate in the UK and in the US. They don't operate in Ireland, they're not actually legally allowed to. But there are payday lenders who advertise a hard sell on TV channels and online, offering loans at not just 1,000 but thousands of percent APR. These are called payday loan companies because what they typically do is they give out a loan to people which is then repayable on the next day that they are paid, which is fine. If you need some cash, you get the loan. But then when you get paid, your entire salary mostly is swiped directly out of your bank account. So you need another loan. And if you have a look at the Last Week Tonight show with John Oliver that I've actually put on the webpage, you can see that the whole business model of these payday loan companies it only works if they trap people in a cycle of needing another loan every time their pay is swiped to pay back the last loan. These are vicious, predatory companies who target people who have low education levels, low levels of financial literacy and low income. And if we can have credit unions offering microfinance instead, that's a far, far better system. Long may those companies be banned from operating in Ireland. But as you said, there are some problems with the credit unions. And the first thing I see when I go to a credit union, and just when I see the credit union, I see that most butchers and bakers and candlestick makers around Ireland, if they want to open a business, they normally rent a premises. The number of credit unions in Ireland who are in custom-built, architect-designed buildings with large surface car parks built in expensive locations, that worries me a bit. Now, in any private company, the staff and the directors are responsible to the shareholders, and the shareholders will see to it that if they're not making money or if they're wasting the money, the staff and the directors will be booted out. In credit unions, theoretically, the savers and the borrowers are the shareholders. Now, that was fine in an era when credit unions were in a drafty church hall and everybody knew everybody who was involved. But credit unions are big business these days. Even if they're not profit-driven, they're still big businesses. And I really don't think that the average person with a few quid in the credit union has the financial wherewithal to tackle directors of credit unions and the staff. And we've seen already some scandals with things going on in credit unions that are absolutely against the rules. And I'm not confident that the spending that credit unions are doing is for the best interests of their shareholders. Also, we saw, as I mentioned at the top of the programme, the credit union movement seemed to be putting together a fund of €100 million to lend to parents of people who are trying to buy houses, in order for those people who are buying the houses to present as their savings their deposit when they're getting a mortgage. That doesn't sound like very prudent lending to me. So what I think is that the credit unions need a regulator with teeth. They need somebody there who is proactive, going through the files of every credit union every year and seeing if they're maintaining prudential practice, seeing if they're sticking to the rules, seeing if they're putting their savers' money at risk. If they don't do that, if we don't have that type of a regulator, then we risk credit unions going the same way as the banks.
If you liked the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
Dublin City Councillor Andrew Montague. Tell me, Andrew, a few years ago we had a big problem with too many houses, surplus in the supply of housing, and we seem to have gone straight from that to a shortage without stopping off at equilibrium in the middle. How did that happen?
There was an oversupply in the country as a whole, but not really so much in Dublin. And I don't think people spotted that. I think in Dublin we weren't far off an equilibrium. We didn't have a significant oversupply. So I think that, that's what happened there, because an awful lot of the oversupply is in places where there is still oversupply. It's in places where people don't really want to live. And house prices have stayed very low in those areas.
Tell me, if I was a person in Dublin right now, desperate to get housing, what solution are you offering?
Well, there's a few things I think that I'm very interested in the idea of increasing supply. I mean, people are talking about price controls and rent controls, but I think they will become an important aspect of how we deal with the situation in the longer term. But if you just think of a village that has 100 families and 90 homes, anything you do to restrict rent or anything you do is not, you're still going to have 10 families who are homeless. no matter what way you organise the rent or no matter what you do to reduce prices. There's still not enough.
That's a fairly clear problem. But in the village that is Dublin, you should know as well as I do that there's a huge amount of unused and underused property. And when your party, the Labour Party, came into government, the proposal that was on the table was for a site value tax, which would target and penalise most of all people who were dog in the manger sitting on empty property. And what we got instead was a property tax based more or less on the value of the property. So if you run down your property to make it worthless, and if you don't actually bring it into use, then you're not being penalised, you're being rewarded by that policy.
Yeah, I would have preferred a site valuation tax. So the Labour Party did argue, I think it would have been our preferred outcome, but we did agree, it's a coalition government, so we came out with this property tax that we have. I think it's property tax is very useful. For example, there's one house was sold last year in Aylesbury Road for 14 million euros, and they're paying 35,000 euros in property tax every year. But just because you don't have a site valuation tax doesn't mean you can't tax underused or derelict sites. And at the moment there is a planning bill going through the Oireachtas try and bring in a derelict sites tax, and that's something that Alan Kelly, the Labour Party Minister for the Environment, is pushing. So I think that would be very useful for us if we can have that tax so that we can deal with derelict and underused sites. So, for example, I was talking to a pharmacist the other day, and she owns a building, and she has a pharmacy on the bottom floor, and upstairs she has empty rooms, but she has to pay rates on those empty rooms. So she's now going about filling them and getting somebody to live in there. So,
but where you have an
empty,
but Andrew, where you have an empty site, and do you know, for example, around Dublin 3, Dublin 8, there's an awful lot of fenced off property where something was knocked down 20 years ago, and the increase in the value of that site, even if the person who owns it, who's probably a millionaire from other sources anyway, so they don't need the cash, but at the height of the boom, they were getting 25 and 30% return on the increase in value of that particular site, which they could use as leverage to borrow elsewhere. But those empty sites are tearing the heart out of Dublin city centre, and
which is exactly why the government is proposing to tax those derelict sites. So I think that
doesn't seem to be too urgent.
It's on the Oireachtas. It's going through the Oireachtas at the moment. And at the moment, we have about 7% of our sites in Dublin are derelict like that, which is pretty normal worldwide for cities. One of the other ways of dealing with it is that I'm talking there about the pharmacy, where it's very common where you have ground floor units being used for retail, and then upper units are often empty. So I want to try through the council to make it easier to bring those units back into action. A classic one is Capel Street. There was a plan for Capel Street a few years ago, and there was a limited take-up. It's called Living Over the Shop Initiative. So essentially, you've got all those units, everybody shops, all those shops are on Capel Street, but they're 4 and 5 story buildings. The ground floor for retail and the floor above that might be storage, but you can have floors 3, 4 and 5 just sitting there empty. And there's 3 or 4 different specific problems for them. One is that a lot of them are protected buildings, so any kind of works that they do on them are restricted. There's also very strict fire regulations, and there's also disability access regulations, which can also cause problems for them. So all 3 of those are under the control of Dublin City Council, and all 3 of them are in different departments of the council. So what I want to do is to create a one-stop shop, so somebody can come in and find out, well, what are all the requirements that I have to meet? And instead of just setting out, well, here's what you have to do, I think that one-stop shop can help them, can show them examples of previous buildings, can, meet with them to try and get them over the line, instead of saying, this is a barrier, you have to reach this. Without reducing any of those standards, we can show people how to do it, give them examples of other buildings that have done it, and actually positively seek to help them.
I think those sound like very good ideas, and what you're saying sounds like the sort of good management that we should have in Dublin City Council and every other council around the country. And that on the supply side, particularly in Dublin, I think definitely has the potential to improve the supply. You might ask the question, why wasn't it done 20 or 30 years ago? But that's maybe a different issue. On the demand side, we saw two things recently. At the end of January, the central bank's plan to require a 20% deposit was halved for first-time buyers, for most first-time buyers, down to a 10% deposit, and there's pressure from the property speculators essentially to have that further reduced. And then in the Sunday Independent this week, there's a story that the credit unions are preparing a €100 million war chest to get their snouts in the trough of the property buying public who they hope are coming back, essentially giving soft loans to the parents of buyers for those buyers then to present as that 10% deposit that supposedly they've saved up themselves. Do you really think that inflating the property market with more cash from buyers without any extra supply is going to help things?
The 10% deposit only applies up to a value of 220,000. So I think it will have some effect. And people who aren't first-time buyers have to have a 20% deposit. So I think it will have some impact. But you're absolutely right. The only way to keep prices steady and stable and reduce rent is to increase the supply. And we are just starting the process for the development plan for Dublin. Now, the development plan is the framework that allows development, that allows the building of houses, the building of homes, the building of apartments. But I think we can look at those standards to see how we can increase the supply. Because, as you say, the supply is absolutely critical. There was some fantastic research done in America. There's a guy called Ed Laser from Harvard University, and he was looking at different areas of America during the boom and bust.
Give me some specific specific things that we can improve.
We need to look at increasing the density of housing so that we can get more housing in a certain area, but the kind of housing that people want to live in. Or you look at Ranelagh, where you have maybe 3- and 4-story terraced houses that were built in the Edwardian area, that kind of time. People love those houses. I'm also very interested in Freiburg in Germany. Instead of everybody parking at their front door, they put a garage in for the whole estate. And so it's, might be a 3- or 4-story garage. So you have to drive in there. It's a secure garage and people leave their cars there. So that means you can get more houses in. But the biggest advantage is that it can become really family friendly. So kids can go out and play. And in those areas where they've done that, they see far more children out and about and playing.
Andrew Montague, thank you very much for that.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
I'm Councillor Frank O'Rourke, based in Selbridge, over in County Kildare, and I'm a Fianna Fáil councillor. The issue that's really annoying and upsetting and exercising people is the setting up of Irish Water right now in a time when probably we could least afford it, and the setup costs, which included the meter installation, salaries, etc., which is in excess of around €1 billion. When you look at the salaries these officials are being paid, not to mention the bonuses in the region of 5 to 20%, it's hugely disturbing and upsetting for people who's really struggling at the moment. Let that be the elderly, the most vulnerable in society, people with special needs, etc., etc. That money could have been easily allocated and better spent in health services.
I'm going to fade Frank out there for a moment because he gives a long list of things that money could be better spent on. So rather than playing the whole thing, let's just all agree that it's a good idea if money isn't wasted.
So it's a shame to see that department being short-changed as a result of having to put extra money into Irish Water. The whole services provided by Irish Water is very disturbing. I deal with them myself, and I know many members of the public do, and trying to engage with them, trying to report fault to a problem, trying to find out when it's been resolved and when it's been sorted, is nothing short of a nightmare. Before this, you could ring up, deal directly with a local authority engineer, technician, supervisor, discuss the issue and have it resolved within a reasonable length of time. Now you're speaking to someone in customer services who really isn't familiar with the issue or the area or the problem, and then it's just all dealt with remotely and at length. And that's very, very, very difficult to engage with, because for me here and for the people I serve, they actually have phoned in with numerous problems to get standard emails back telling them the issue has actually been resolved, but actually it hasn't been resolved, or telling them the problem has been investigated and is therefore now put to bed and finished with. But actually it hasn't, because what they need to do is, obviously, if that was proper engagement, investigate the problem properly and make sure that it doesn't reoccur. So what I'm hearing from the people on the street, with the public that I represent, but also from my own engagement with Irish Water, it's pretty much a nightmare trying to get issues resolved, solved, investigated and dealt with comprehensively and properly. And this is a huge problem, because the contact locally on the ground has now been taken away. And the most frustrating part of all of this, you deal with Irish Water on an issue, they deal with the local authority people who I would have been dealing with directly, get them to look at the problem, go back to Irish Water then evaluates what they're saying and then decides either to go ahead with it or not. So really you have another layer of bureaucracy at a huge cost to the taxpayer, which is unnecessary, because the same people in the local authority are still doing the job. Irish Water are just basically taking the messages and processing them down the line to the council, which is a bit ridiculous at a time when our country can easily afford it.
Oh dear, I knew Irish Water had to come up. There's three things to say about that. I want to thank Frank O'Rourke, who's a Fianna Fáil councillor, for bringing that up, because he allows me to say a few different things about it. And the first thing you have to say about that is that he's absolutely correct that Irish Water is being set up in a disastrously bad way. The amount of money being spent is gobsmacking. The fees for consultants, the levels of bonuses are just off the scale, and the fact that people are being hired not for any need of labour but because of union agreements, this is outrageous. The fact that people are getting bonuses that are unconditional, this is outrageous. I think we agree on that. But there's a second thing to say here. Even if we're doing it in a horribly bad way, the principle is right. We should be paying for water, and we should be paying for it at the point of use. By the way, we don't have any choice about paying for it. Either it's paid for through fees for water, or it's paid for through the taxes. The right way is to pay for it at the point of use. Exactly the same way as we pay for electricity. Because if we didn't pay for electricity at the point of use, then nobody would bother to get a low energy light bulb, and nobody would bother even to turn out the lights when they went to bed at night, or even when they went off on holidays. There's no reason why people who use water carefully should be punished and made to cover the cost of people who waste it. And of course, there'll be a lot less people who waste water once they know that they personally can save money by not being wasteful. But the third thing to say here is that even when Ireland does the right thing, we do it in a horribly wrong way. I don't need to mention PPARs, I don't need to mention electronic voting and many, many other items on the long list of things that shouldn't have cost much money and that in Ireland cost an enormous amount and didn't work anyway. And Frank, I'm sorry to say, but you're part of the problem. You make the point about when you call up Irish Water and their call centre is just handing on the query to the local authority engineers who you would have spoken to in any case. But take one step back from that. Why are you in the loop? Nobody calls you up if their Sky TV doesn't work. If their Sky TV doesn't work, they call up Sky and Sky fix it, or they lose the business. When people lose their water, or if there's a leak or some other problem, they shouldn't be calling their local politician, because that makes a system of political patronage that is poisoning Ireland. If people need to ring their local politician to get a pipe fixed, is it really any surprise that that sort of system of political patronage carries on up the chain, so that when people want to get a contract for computers that don't work, they can get onto their political friends, bypass the system, and get the contract to a company that shouldn't be getting it because they can't do it.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
And that's nearly it for episode number 1 of Here's How. Please follow Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and please retweet our messages. Please give us a like on Facebook, and please subscribe on iTunes or any other podcast platform. You can find out how to do all of those at the website at www.here'show.ie. And don't forget just to tell your friends as well. My name is William Campbell. Thank you for listening.